The following program is sponsored and funded by Faith to Victory Ministries.
Hi, this is Michael Collins, founder and director of ministry services with Faith to Victory Ministries, and I want to welcome you to Wednesday night Bible study. Welcome to Wednesday night Bible study, and this week we are continuing in the book of Nehemiah. We're getting into chapter 5. Up to this point, Nehemiah had organized the work that was going on here, getting the walls rebuilt in the city of Jerusalem. He had organized all this very well. He had selected guards to protect the people from the threats of attack that they had received from their enemies. But now there were other problems that were cropping up, other problems that were developing from within. So let's begin reading in verse 1 as we read verses 1 through 5. And we're reading from the Holman Christian Standard Bible translation of God's Word. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 5, there was a widespread outcry from the people and their wives against the Jewish countrymen. Some were saying, "We, our sons and our daughters, are numerous. Let us get grain so that we can eat and live." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, vineyards, and homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have borrowed money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. We and our children are just like our countrymen and their children, yet we are subjecting our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters are already enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others." The wealthy Jews thought that they saw an opportunity here to make a good profit, but they were doing these things in a way that was unfair to the poorer Jews. In fact, it was often rather cruel. So the poor people began to complain about it, and there was a famine in the country, and there were many who were hungry. They couldn't afford to buy the food that they needed to feed their families, and they couldn't afford to pay their taxes. Also, because they were building the city wall, they were not able to do other work which could provide income for them to be able to take care of their families. So probably they weren't able to grow their own food either, and they had no money to buy food. So they were being forced to ask the richer people to lend them money. Some of the poor people even had to sell their property. If they still did not have enough money, they would have to sell their sons and sell their daughters as slaves. They didn't think this was right, and they could see that the rich people were making great profits from their situation and from their adversity. So the poor people became very angry, and they complained about how things were being done unfairly and unjustly. This was an opportunity for the rich people to become even richer. They knew that the poor people were desperate, so the rich people were forcing the poor people to pay too much money for their loans. Now as we move into verses 6 through 9, when Nehemiah heard about what was happening, he was very angry about it, and rightfully so. He didn't want to stop the work on the walls. They couldn't afford to do that, but he felt compassion for these poor people who were being taken advantage of. So he was very careful as he thought about what he could do to resolve the issue. So he arranged a big meeting to deal with the problem. Now as we begin reading in verse 6 through 9, it says, "I became extremely angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. After seriously considering the matter, I accused the nobles and officials, saying to them, 'Each of you is charging his countrymen interest.' So I called a large assembly against them and said, 'We have done our best to buy back our Jewish countrymen who were sold to foreigners, but now you sell your own countrymen, and we have to buy them back.' They remained silent and could not say a word. Then I said, 'What you are doing isn't right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God and not invite the reproach of our foreign enemies?'" The rich people who were behind the profit-making scheme here were the chief men and the officials. Nehemiah told them that what they were doing was most definitely the wrong thing, especially now. And the result was that their own people were suffering because of their greed. So Nehemiah reminded the rich people that some Jews had been slaves before. When Nehemiah had returned to Judah, he and his companions had tried to buy these slaves back. Now their own people were making them slaves again. Nehemiah told the rich people that they had not obeyed God's commands. God had sent the Jews into exile because they didn't obey his commands, just like this. And if the rich leaders respected God, they wouldn't be doing these things. But otherwise the Jews would be ashamed, and their enemies would laugh at them for working against one another. The rich people couldn't answer Nehemiah because they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew that they had no excuse for treating the poor members of their society that way. This passage shows us a very important fact about Nehemiah's character. Nehemiah was a very sincere man, and he did the right things whether anybody noticed it or not. He used his own financial resources to free the Jews who had been slaves. Nehemiah didn't care whether he impressed other people or not. He just wanted to please God, and he was trying to get those who were in the wrong to do the same thing. Now as we move on to verses 10 through 13, Nehemiah and his companions had also lent money and grain to the poor people. They hadn't charged the people money for the loans. Nehemiah had obeyed God's command, and he was a good role model to the other leaders of the people. Now as we begin reading in verses 10 through 13, beginning in verse 10, it says, "Even I, as well as my brothers and my servants, have been lending them money and grain. Please, let us stop charging this interest. Return their fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and houses to them immediately, along with the percentage of the money, grain, and new wine, and olive oil that you have been assessing them." They responded, "We will return these things, and require nothing more from them. We will do as you say." So I summoned the priests and made everyone take an oath to do this. I also shook the folds of my robe and said, "May God likewise shake from his house and property everyone who doesn't keep his promise. May he be shaken out and have nothing." The whole assembly said amen, and they praised the Lord. Then the people did as they had promised. Nehemiah ordered the rich leaders to give back to the poor people their property. He also told the leaders to give back the money that they had charged the poor people for the loans. The leaders agreed to do what Nehemiah had ordered them to do, and they promised to give all the property and the money back, just as he had asked them to do. So Nehemiah called the priests. He wanted them to hear the leaders' promise. Then the leaders would realize that God knew about these promises, and they would be obligated to God to do the things that they had promised to do. So the leaders did what they had promised to do, and all the people were happy and satisfied with the outcome, and a resolution was reached to solve a problem between the rich and the poor Jews that otherwise could have turned into a very destructive situation. Now as we go into the conclusion of this chapter, verses 14 through 19, here we find out something more about Nehemiah. He was not only a good leader, but he was also a good role model to the people as well. Beginning in verse 14, it says, "Furthermore, from the day King Artaxerxes appointed me to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until his 32nd year, 12 years, I and my associates never ate from the food allotted to the governor. The governors who preceded me had heavily burdened the people, taking food and wine from them, as well as a pound of silver. Their subordinates also oppressed the people, but I didn't do this because of the fear of God. Instead, I devoted myself to the construction of the wall, and all my subordinates were gathered there for the work. We didn't buy any land. There were 150 Jews and officials, as well as guests from the surrounding nations at my table. Each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some fowl were prepared for me. An abundance of all kinds of wine was provided every 10 days. But I didn't demand the food allotted to the governor because the burden on the people was so heavy. Remember me favorably, my God, for all that I have done for this people." Nehemiah became the ruler, so that made him a very important man, but he still had a very humble attitude, and he genuinely cared about the people. The king allotted the ruler to have special food. This probably means the ruler could tax the people, but Nehemiah didn't want to do this because he felt like it would disrespect God and it would hurt the people. Nehemiah knew that many of the people here were poor and were struggling just to be able to eat. They had to pay tax to the king also. Nehemiah was probably already rich because the king had appointed him as the ruler. Now, the previous rulers of Judah that came before him had not been such good leaders as he was. They took silver as well as food and wine from the people. Nehemiah didn't even want to obtain his own property. His job was to lead the people and to build the city walls. He invited so many people to eat with him every day. He paid for the food himself. He was the ruler for 12 years, and all that time he invited other people to eat his food with him, never asking them to give him anything in return. Nehemiah just wanted God to be pleased, and it was because of this respect that Nehemiah had for God that he became a good and generous leader for the people. So in this chapter, we discover not only the exceptional counseling and mediating and leadership skills of Nehemiah, we also learn a lot about his character and his integrity, both of which contributed to the favor that God showed towards him. Nehemiah wasn't concerned about any recognition or any praises for his actions to be able to keep the peace among his people. He just wanted to please God. He just wanted to walk in obedience to God's commands and live his life every day in a manner that would show respect and reverence to the God that he loved. You know, that's a great lesson that we can all afford to learn and put into practice daily. Nehemiah's choice to stay on track according to God's plan and purpose, and to convince those who were going off course to take into consideration the consequences of their disobedience to God's commands, was evidence of his devotion to act according to God's will in every given circumstance, no matter what. God always has the last say when it comes to what's right and what's wrong, especially in our dealings with other people. And as long as we're following the instructions that the Lord gives us in the Bible, we'll do the right thing and we'll treat others the right way. I want to thank you again for joining me this evening on Wednesday Night Bible Study. We've been covering chapter 5 of the book of Nehemiah. Next week, we'll tackle chapter 6, so I hope you'll join me then. Until then, be blessed, be encouraged, keep moving forward, and remember, where there's faith, there will be victory. Have a blessed day.
For more daily inspiration and encouragement from Faith to Victory Ministries, find us on Facebook, Google+, and YouTube.
You're listening to the FTV Radio Network, broadcasting exclusively on Spreaker.com Internet Radio and iHeartRadio.